Salve Omnes, I am Ruminus, and today we are doing a review for the game Titan Souls, which is an indie game where the main character is a genocidal warlord bent on the destruction of the ancient Titans who gave birth to the world. The story is actually entirely told in the descriptions for the Titans and the random cave paintings around the world. The game is set in some ancient land that is long forgotten. There are multiple sections with sets of bosses, and those sections will often have a different biome or theme. There is lava, ice, forest, grave, and other areas. The bosses are resting peacefully in their abandoned homes until your little butt shows up to eat their souls. The purpose of the game is to slaughter enough Titans and absorb their souls to enter the temple and purify the world of these old creatures. That is pretty much all that's directly told. There is one Titan who speaks a bit and gives a clearer purpose, although it boils down to the humans will kill the Titans and the same will eventually happen to us. Just like the Titans in the Greek and Roman world killed their parents and the gods killed them, and so on and so forth. It will take about 3 to 4 hours to beat the game on a first playthrough, mostly trying to figure out the methods to kill these Titans. It will take about an hour in a replay, or even less for those who are really skilled in the game. For gameplay control, the game has consistent controls where none of the actions get mixed up, the actions do what they're supposed to do. I did find issues with the arrows sometimes hitting the enemy and not killing, but that usually happened when the arrow was on the edge of their hitbox, and so it can be easily explained that I may have missed. The game's precision will allow the player to cancel the arrow, shift from running to walking without an issue. When committed to a roll or hurling the arrow, the player can't cancel or change, since the action's already in play, and this makes the player have to be sure of their action before they do it. There is a bit of planned latency when completing the major actions. When the arrow is prepped, the player needs to take a second to charge, and the same is needed when retrieving the arrow. When cancelling out of these actions, there is also a slight pause before the character can do anything else. There is no noticeable or unplanned latency, the controls respond when pressed. The controls are frequently used, or at least given the chance to be used often. The entire game is a boss rush, so the attacking, evading, and running controls are thus used very frequently throughout the entire game. Each control has great utility. The running helps keep the character away from attacks, the dodging gives a quick escape from death, and the arrow helps murder the sleeping Titans who just want you to get off their lawn. The game gives full autonomy outside of the tutorial. The game never directs or forces the player to do certain actions or areas. The order of the boss is entirely up to the player. The character has enough movement to get through the areas and fights. The character can either walk, run, or roll. The areas are simple walkways with a few puzzles, but they do not require any platforming or movement that is not in the game or matching what controls are available. The speed is enough to get the player from here to there and to escape the bosses, although the map is quite sparse and a little too big for the speed outside of the combat. The camera is fixed to the character and the view is 2D top-down. The viewable area is quite large, giving realistic perspective to make the Titans seem like Titans compared to my small, squishy body. The view is enough to see the bosses, pathways, and any traps in the fights. Outside of the combat, the view is enough to clearly see the possible paths to transition to the next area. Because the view is so far away, not many details can be easily seen. The game grows in that each boss is unique, except for a few golems that repeat in form but have different attacks. Most bosses are one-hit kill besides a few, like the Spike Flower and the legendary Titan Slayer, who will give you a taste of your own medicine, so the growth comes from the challenge of figuring out how to kill the specific bosses. They have unique attacks and unique weak spots, so the game constantly grows between each fight. The flow of the game is pretty linear. The story doesn't change unless the player reaches the one Titan who talks, the music stays pretty calm when venturing and becomes intense when in a fight, the controls never change, so the only growth is from the bosses, and thus it doesn't change frequently. However, I think that this linear flow works for the game, as too much would overwhelm the player or feel like it's trying to drag out the playtime for this short game. The game is pretty difficult as it is also one-hit kill for the player. The difficulty truly lies on knowing how to kill the bosses, as their weak spot and cycles need to be known. Once their pattern and weakness are known, it becomes a matter of being able to hit, although it is still challenging. After completing the game, there are options to remove certain movements and an option for a one-life run, but I find these to be more frustrating than challenging. These modes force the player to master the hidden techniques of killing the bosses, rather than challenge the player's ability to kill the bosses. Playing the game regularly without a run or roll quickly makes it overwhelming to beat and more frustrating. The game is perfectly sustainable for its short length, but there is also a little bit extra for multiple playthroughs. Because each boss is unique and not all need to be killed to beat the game, it never becomes stagnant. The controls are simple enough to master easily, and the map is pretty easy to navigate so that the player doesn't get lost. The amount of Titans is enough, more would probably be a burden, while less would make the world seem empty and boring. After beating the game, there are certain challenges and detrimental mechanics, but for me, the regular game is enough, and the challenges aren't fun enough for me to make me try them. The story is pretty hidden. You wake up as a boy, possibly? Not really sure on that one, with a magic bow and arrow. You can throw and retrieve this arrow, and thus it is your mission to massacre these ancient titans who are often sleeping in their lost world. There is no other purpose except for the titan who mentions that is the vicious cycle of the descendant species to kill their ancestors, and that the player will have to kill a shadow self at the very end of the game. I'm not entirely sure what purpose or cause of this was, so I think that it's either purposely hidden to make the player look at the random drawings, or there really isn't one, and it's really just there to have fun killing these massive beings. The story is nothing new or particularly interesting. I don't find it unique. It seems to play on the Greco-Roman idea that the Titans killed the planetary masses, and the gods killed the Titans, and so the mortals killed the gods. It seems like the Titans helped build and form the world, so I'm unsure why we are eradicating them. Perhaps the theme or moral is that we murder without question, or destroy the things that care for us, or disregard the good and evil of our actions? The game's music and sound are very fitting and well produced. The sounds for each action are clear and distinct. The arrow has a pulling air effect to signify when the arrow is at full power, the run has a steady click to signify the heavy steps, and the roll has a short sound. The Titans' movement are often met with heavy thuds since they are strong and the elemental attacks match the sound that the element would make. The music in the game is subdued. There is a slight, calming theme when wandering around to give an idea of lonesome yet surreal. When in combat, the music is intense to relate to the struggle between the small mortal fly and the titanic jello blob. Overall, the music is present enough and fitting for the themes. In times of wandering, the music helps fill the silence, but subtly without distracting the player. The game is reliable in its mechanics. The checkpoints will always show how many and the general direction of the bosses. The player is never inhibited from the controls or standard practices of the game. Some bosses, like the Yeti, will have detrimental mechanics while others don't, but those are rare and not extreme, and so the general idea that a boss will have an attack or vulnerable pattern is reliable still. Everything is one hit except for about 8 bosses, so there is some inconsistency there, especially when some will stagger after the first hit and others will continue to be a hazard once hit. The ice area is the only area which I can recall that forces the player to break objects in order to proceed, which is odd and took me a bit to figure out what the game wanted. The winding forest is also unique but are pretty standard in games, and the game does give the solutions to find the bosses in this hidden forest in the other areas, although I found no in-game hints within the forest to show that the pattern was found elsewhere in these outside areas. The game has a few manipulative mechanics. At the beginning of a new game after a first completion, the player can choose to have no roll or run, 1 life, faster bosses, and translated text to get more of the story. Once selected, these options cannot be deselected for the entire playthrough. The manipulatives are all, except the text one, tied to a more difficult game, although I don't know what 6 sack of cement wants to make this game harder. This game's sounds add some assistive mechanics where there are particular distinct, loud sounds for rolling, running, and shooting/retrieving the arrow. This helps the player know if their actions went through and what the character is doing, which is helpful when the bosses are moving at the speed of light and I don't have time to see if the arrow boy stopped running. The checkpoints are also nice since they tend to be close to all the bosses, which helps when the player dies, which is a frequently happening event. All of the manipulative mechanics are detrimental. They take away the evading controls, make the enemies move faster, and remove the function of the checkpoints. For many bosses, they will have specific attacks to limit the player movement, have a hazard on screen, shake the screen slightly, or otherwise impede the player. Most of it is not intrusive or imbalanced, but they are there to give the bosses some uniquity and some extra challenge. The game has a few guiding mechanics to help the player navigate the area and discern the weak points in the bosses. Pathways are often marked with brown footpaths to show where transitions to new places are, even the slight patch for one of the secret titans. The climbable vines are often easy to see and wide enough to catch the player's attention. The checkpoints provide a guide to check which bosses have been beaten and where. Each icon at the north, south, east, and west sections tell the general direction of where to go and will illuminate when the boss is defeated. For the bosses, most vulnerable sections will be highlighted in some fashion with a contrasting color, some will even glow. Although it may be difficult to figure out how to hit the weak spot, it is always clear what the player needs to hit, except for the last boss, which is a little slightly unclear. As for the intuitive mechanics, the game's tutorial is the only spot where it directly tells the player anything. Otherwise, the game has all the text and info either in cryptic wall paintings or in the language of the Titans. All other things, including how to kill the bosses, are intuitive. You need to figure out the boss's patterns, the best method to attack, where to go, how to hunt these helpless giants down. The ice area has some giant snowballs that block the path, but the intuitive thought I had was to launch a fire arrow at it, which didn't work. Instead, the character can roll through them. Then, the ice wall can be melted with a fire arrow, It's not very reliable and not very intuitive. All other areas, though, have good intuitive mechanics, like the forest immediately telling you that you failed to find a secret path, instead of letting you wander for a few sections and then sending you back to the home base. The game has multiple thematic mechanics, especially with the bosses. Each area has bosses that will match the biome of the area, like the Yeti in the snow area or the lava ball in the volcano. Not all bosses resemble the theme, but there are plenty to match. Since we are eliminating the Titan race, the bosses are thus all massive and have devastating powers. They were the ones who gave life to the world, or something. Still not exactly sure on the story, but they have elemental powers and great strength, making them worthy enemies to mount on the mantle. Many of the attacks will also match, where the giant treasure chest shoots money and crushes your tiny skull with massive coins. The character has a spiritual arrow which is indestructible and capable of magic flight, fitting for the ethereal world that we are in. As to why the Titans don't attack first or start hunting this puny ant after a few are killed, or why there is another Titan Slayer who is much better at this job than I do not know or understand. The game has a 1-minute tutorial basically to understand the basics of the controls. The controls are all directly explained, then lets the player go into a room with 3 options for Titan murder. The camera and autonomy, however, are never taken away from the player, as the controls are prompted in text or a picture, whereas the controls are directly stated. What to do with the bosses are not. It is intuitively shown that the bosses are docile until attacked. Once a fight is begun, the character cannot leave until victory, and there is a specific weakness that the player must hit. One boss in the tutorial requires breaking the shield with an environmental assistance, and another has multiple hits before death. The tutorial shows everything that will be needed to know within the first few bosses that carry over across the entire game. The game's user interface has no hub or overlay. I would say that the game could benefit either from a map or larger view, as there is plenty of empty space between the distinct regions and it's easy to get lost. The game doesn't need much else, as there is no health bar for either the enemies or the character, and the bosses with more than 1 HP are visibly hurt or different when weakened. When the arrow is shot, it is not only typically on screen, but the feathers are missing from your quiver, although it can be difficult to see at times, but you only have 1 arrow, so it is easy to keep track of. The game's colors, foreground, background, sound, and all alike come together to make a very good user experience, as the different aspects are easy to tell apart. There are only 2 menus, the start and pause. There are minimal settings to mess around with, and everything is in a single menu. The interface is easy to navigate and understand. The text is white, small, but against a darkened background, and the in-game text is massive, with a shadow to make it easy to see and read, and doesn't interfere with the boss battles. The graphics are pixel, 8-bit reminiscent, and the style is surreal and otherworldly, which matches with the themes of being in a different dimension, or something like that, still not really sure. Because the camera is far away, the low graphics blend into a pretty scene for most of the time. The Titans have much more color and detail to them than the player. Despite the simplistic style and low graphics, the images are still clear. It is easy to tell what enemy and objects are. The animations are clean and fitting for each enemy. The characters' movements are slightly unrealistic for the speed, but fitting thematically for the world. The bosses move across gigantic space, and some spin like a ballerina, but each movement befits the style and build of the Titan. No boss feels like it moves weirdly or out of place. The game doesn't have many options, but it is otherwise accessible to those who can play fast-paced, high-tension games. If you have any disability regarding quick actions or trial and error, then this game will be stressful for you. Otherwise, the colors are distinct enough, the weak points are contrasting, so even for those with color blindness, it shouldn't be much of an issue. The enemies, because they will match in theme with the environment, will sometimes match the color scheme of the foreground or background, which could make an issue for color blindness or visual impairment. The pause screen text is a little small and blocky, which may cause a slight issue for those with lexical disabilities, but the text only happens at the start and pause menus, which should hardly ever happen, and so shouldn't really be an issue. The game's sounds are distinct enough to be able to correlate them with specific actions, which can help those who rely more on audio help. For those with hearing impairment, the visuals are clean and unique for the controls, and the bosses have clear telegraphs, making it easy to play even without sound. For a final score, I give the gameplay a 30 out of 35, a story a 2 out of 5, the sound a 4 out of 5, the mechanics a 26 out of 30, the tutorial a 4 out of 5, the UI and UX a 4 out of 5, the graphics a 5 out of 5, and accessibility a 4 out of 5. Overall, I give this game a 4 out of 5. I suggest this game for anybody who enjoys challenging boss fights. The story is nothing amazing or really even present, but the enemies are fun and challenging, mostly. There are a few issues with some bosses taking too many hits, or there being such a short window to kill after dodging or weakening the boss, but generally the fights are balanced. The fights do lose a significant amount of challenge once the gimmick is learned. When the player knows how to kill the Titans who are just defending against a home intruder, the challenge is mostly to dodge a cycle of attacks, then retaliate. The bosses lose some challenge after this is learned, but the bosses are still challenging from their skills and range. If you enjoy action or puzzle games, I think you will enjoy Titan Souls, particularly if you don't care for story or boring tutorials. Although I do wish a tutorial would just let me play the game a little bit rather than just directly telling me every single thing. The game throws you into the action and leaves you alone. There are enough bosses to make it interesting, but not too many that it becomes dull and a chore. Thanks everybody for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, ring the bell to be notified of future videos. If you have any disagreements, if you have any constructive criticism, anything you think that I missed, or games that are similar to this or fit along this theme, please leave it in the comment section below so I can check it out and continue this discourse. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time. Walete omnes.